Welcome, everyone, to the Choose to Think Inspirational podcast. And I am so glad that you're here. On the show today, I have a gentleman named Ben Virgo. And let me read you just a little bit about him and what he does. You're going to be fascinated by our discussion today. I just know it. I can't even wait. I'm just like sitting here in my seat. I've got Rico in my lap, and I'm just like chomping at the bit here to get going and to dive into some of what he does in his life. And so as he's going to share his ministry with you, with all my listeners, I just can't wait for that. But Ben is the director of Christian Heritage London, which is an organization devoted to telling the stories of how the gospel has changed the world in London, how it continues to change the world in London, and that it might change the world again. He gives tours through London, the British Museum, and he hosts the Christian Heritage London podcast. And I'm going to put all these links in the show notes for you so that you can get in touch with him and kind of figure out or find out a little bit more about him. He also runs the George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, and William Wilberforce Twitter pages, and he's a speaker as well. He lives in the projects in East London. Now, I know what I think of when I say projects, but maybe you can talk about that in a minute here as well, if you don't mind. But this is where he's planting a church among Bangladeshi Muslims with his family. So, oh my goodness, is your head spinning now? But thank you so much for coming, Ben, and welcome to the Choose to Think podcast.
Oh, it's a delight to be with you, Victoria.
So good. You know, I just interviewed a gentleman who he is a soccer coach at Pepperdine University, but he's also from England. And so I actually practiced my British accent with him. And I don't know that I will grace you with that today, Ben. My listeners are probably like, Victoria, please don't embarrass us. But anyway, I want to also share something else that you wrote as you and I were communicating, and which is just fascinating to me. And this is what you say. You say, all over the world, when people are looking for an example for how the gospel can change the world, they start talking about London, because they start talking about Wilberforce, Spurgeon, Whitefield, Elizabeth Fry, John Newton, people who have inspired generations of Christians. If the gospel is true, if it really is the case that God has lived with people and has given his life to save them, then that will have changed history. The extraordinary news is that it has, incredibly, undeniably, and beautifully. And you would love to tell some stories about what God has done in London based on some of the wonderful stories that you get to tell your guests all over the world, like when they come on your tours, is what I'm assuming here. Each one of the heroes that you talk about was a simple believer, and none of them thought that they were heroes. In fact, each of them had their own heroes who they looked back at. The great news is that history hasn't finished. There are ordinary people who now are being inspired by these stories, and they are being inspired to live for the same living Christ who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And we could end this show right there, because that is so beautifully written. I love that. I love how you articulated that. But where can we start now? What can you share? I don't even care where we start. Just tell us something about what you're so passionate about, and why history is so important, and why we need to think about these things and consider these things, and what difference does it really make? So anywhere, all of the above.
Yeah.
Yay.
Well, the delightful thing of Victoria is when someone becomes a Christian, it isn't about them, it's about Christ. When
Amen.
Paul writes Romans, the first thing he says, I want to talk to you about the gospel, which is concerning Christ. Jesus, who was descended from David, who was raised from the dead, and through whom we preach the gospel, that it might bring about the obedience of faith. So Paul is absolutely preoccupied with Jesus, and when he starts his epistles, he always starts with praise be to the God and Father. He's always praising. He's just astonished at this great and wonderful gospel. And the people about whom we tell the stories in London, you find again and again and again and again and again that they themselves were simply astonished at the grace of God, and they themselves don't think very much of themselves. But what you do find is consistently, if you read their lives, if you read the private letters, if you read their journals, you think, hang on, this is like my journals, because I feel like I should be further on. I feel like I don't know why he still puts up with me. But it's his love. I just read something in the Bible this morning, and it just reminded me, he loves me. In fact, Victoria, if you read the biographies of some of these great heroes, it's quite clear that the people who wrote the biographies, they don't get it. They're astonished themselves. They say, for example, the people who've written great biographies of William Wilberforce, the man who abolished the slave trade, which set free 800,000 slaves. The people who wrote his biographies, they expect he's going to be some sort of a mastermind, a genius organizer. But when you read his own diaries, you find, oh my goodness, he's struggling with the same things we are. He feels discouraged. He feels disappointed. Plus, you read his letters and you find he's always late. He's hilarious fun. He's totally spontaneous. He's chaotically disorganized, and he changed the world. So what happened? How does this work? Jesus tells us, if you want to bear fruit, abide in me. And if you read his journals, and they have just published his journals, literally in the last 6 months, Michael McMullen edited the new version, the first time his unpublished spiritual journals have been published. You find page after page after page of a man who just looks like us. He's wrestling with the truth. He's resolving, today I'm going to stand, and feeling like I wish I'd done better, but I must stand on Christ. I must stand on Christ. And he changed the world. That's an encouragement to us, Victoria. None of these heroes got it all right. None of these heroes were superheroes. They just knew there was a man who was God, who lived here, who died, and it worked. He rose again. And that was their hope, and it changed history.
That is such a remarkably encouraging word for me, and I'm sure for our listeners. What a wonderful reminder. Too often, for me personally, I think I have to be at this level, or sometimes I may engage a thought like, Victoria, who are you to do a podcast? Or, you just snapped at the lady at the local grocery store. You don't measure up. I mean, I can begin to even tell myself those kinds of things when really, and I can compare myself to others. And often when I compare myself to others, they always look better, and they're always doing better, and they look perfect, and they've got their, their kids have their hair just down just right, and Sally's got a pretty bow on, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm telling my kids, I don't care if you have your shoes on or not, get out, that we're going out the door. And just that disparity between maybe what I want to be or how polished I would like to be, but really then how authentically and transparently I am. Thank goodness that we serve a God who is perfect, but that we don't have to. And just the reminder that these greats, these heroes we think of as heroes, these greats, they had their weaknesses too. They may have had their doubts, and they wrestled. And I love that you bring us to that. I am today. Can I order that Wilberforce's journals through? Can I get that like on Amazon?
I tell you, amazingly enough, Michael McMullen, who put it out, asked me if I'd like to put a recommendation, which is an amazing honor to me.
Wow.
But it's the previously unpublished spiritual journals of William Wilberforce, and Eric Metaxas says it's an inestimable treasure. I say it's one of the most important books to have come out in the last 10 years, because this man, just to come back to Wilberforce there, here is a man who, firstly, he does not make his money from the church. Okay, it isn't his job to be a Christian. and yet he's feeding on Jesus. And you have to say, well, the fact is, everyone who knew him, they could see he's always humming a hymn of praise. He's always worshiping. And he brought about world change. He ended, I mean, the numbers you're talking about, the economic impact of the end of the slave trade. I mean, you're talking about something like, making electricity illegal or something. It was that unlikely that they're going to actually abolish. Or how about this? It'd be like abolishing abortion. Right. Imagine that. Right. And here's a guy saying, I know it's impossible, but I know someone for whom impossible is possible. And he just feeds on him. He feeds on him. Say it's a blessing. It's a blessing. But the other thing is, on that a similar theme there, Victoria, you're immediately reminding me of John Wesley there. You see, John Wesley, because you're talking there about something which all Christians feel. We all feel, we all feel like, am I real? Am I the real thing? I see these others, they're doing better than me. Well, John Wesley, you see, he's an Oxford academic who tried to become a missionary. He had a terrible time there. He went to America, he went to Savannah, Georgia, and of course he started preaching the law. He started preaching, try harder. Try harder, try hard. He was one of those guys who, and I'm sure you and I, everyone who's listening to this will know people like this, who they themselves aren't actually trying harder, but they're trying to make themselves try harder by telling everyone else to do it. Yes. It makes them, if I put pressure on you, then I must do it. And it's just that I'm just doing all I can just to try and force myself forward. Well, he was that guy. He's like, you guys try harder, and then I must. But guess what happened? Of course, it didn't work, because the law, the law condemns. It does not give life. Paul tells us that. Paul calls the law the ministry of death. It shows you how desperately you need to be saved. And Wesley was preaching, try harder, try. It's amazing he lasted 2 years before he got completely shown up. He got disappointed, disillusioned, comes back to England, 24th of May, 1738. He's in the city of London, where I go on the walk, and he says, I went to St. Paul's Cathedral to evensong. And then he says, in the evening, I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street, where someone was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ alone for salvation. And an assurance was given me that he'd taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. Now, he had understood the gospel is not instructions. The gospel is an announcement. It's finished. He did it. But did it work? Yeah, he was raised. It worked. Now, when Wesley understood that was the gospel, he started to preach that. They think he preached it about 40,000 times.
Oh my goodness.
He dies in 1791. In fact, he dies, He dies the 2nd of March. So that's tomorrow, after the day we're recording this, in 1791. And by the time he died, he was considered the most loved man in England. But interestingly enough, Victoria, at the time he died, of course, in France, they were having the Industrial Revolution. Tens of thousands were massacred. The rich, then the people who knew the rich, and then the people who, just anyone who got in the way. For decades, France was just considered to be anarchy. Now, secular historians, non-Christian historians say the reason we didn't have a revolution in England at that time is because John Wesley changed the nation. Now, that is significant, because what was it that changed the nation? Well, John Wesley just tried it a little bit harder. No, it isn't. Because he got the best technique. No, it isn't. He understood someone tried perfectly, and he gave his life. He took the blame, and he rose. That gospel, secular historians say, changed history. See, that gospel. Now, you try fixing yourself. You can't. You need a Christ You need a Christ who has died and has risen. And that's what all these stories, they all hinge on that. They all hinge on that, where it's Wesley or Wilberforce or the slave trader John Newton, a horrible, horrible man, or aristocrats like Lord Shaftesbury, who brought about free education and the end of child slavery. And they all hinge at Christ. They all hinge at Christ. Yeah.
Wow. I'm like, who are you, Ben Virgo? You're amazing. And the way you tie all of this in together, I'm like, tell me more stories. I can see why our mutual friend, Christina Stanton, said, Victoria, I have a podcast guest for you. And she took your tour, and she said in her own words that the tour that you offered, and I'm not sure how long it was. I don't even know what she toured, her group, but she said it was the highlight of their entire mission trip. And that, I guess, she was so inspired. I can see that so easily now. And I just keep thinking, tell us more stories, because I'm not exactly like, you are the historian extraordinaire. I don't doubt that at all. And you know your craft, you loved your craft, and you share that with so many, and you get to tell these things over and over again. But what I just want to say, keep telling stories, or how, and I also want to know in a moment a little bit more about you personally and even your family. But can you tell us a few more of these other great stories, even Spurgeon? Sure. And I would love to know what it is they learned, and how they were these big changers. I know their names and I know of them, and of course I know that, but tell us some of these other details. I'm loving this.
Yeah. Well, this is the question you're asking there. The irony is, and the interesting thing is, Victoria, is that this isn't something strange. It isn't something strange that stories should inspire us. Think about the Bible. Mm-hmm. It's not a textbook. It's a book full of stories. And we learn what God is like by the way he treated kings and princes. Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
And judges. And if you go, one of the other things I do is I give tours through the British Museum. And when you get to the Egyptian pharaohs, their statues, they all look the same, because each one of them they were just considered to be perfect. I don't know if you've seen footage of VJ Day when the Japanese emperor spoke to the nation, and there is video footage of the Japanese people all on their knees and on their faces as they hear the voice of the emperor. There was this idea that the king was perfect. He is the perfect example of all that is perfect. The Bible gives us kings who are fallible, who are human, who are weak. And we see different personalities. We see Hezekiah's, we see Ahab's, we see Solomon's, and so on. And as I go through the British Museum, we see in the British Museum is the only image of one of the kings of Israel. And we delight to tell the stories of what God did through these people. It is an awesome thing that you can jump on a bus in London and go to a museum where you have bowls that were held, very likely, by Nehemiah, where you see the handwriting of a Bible character, and where you see awesome vindications of the Bible. And the British Museum has this little plaque next to them saying, "This is Jehu, who is named in the Bible, 1 Kings 9-10." And it's not saying maybe. It's that, no, that's which is fascinating, because at the moment people say, "Well, the Bible's been changed," and you say, "Oh, tell me about your research."
Right.
Like you talk about, we're planting a church here among Muslims, and they are just certain, "Oh, the Bible's been changed," because they've been told that. And you can look at them and say, "Just tell me about your research." They don't know.
Right.
They don't.
Right.
And it's similar, your average college kid, "Tell me about your research." "Oh, I my favorite comedian says it's been changed." Well, let me take you to the British Museum and show you. The British Museum says this is the guy who's in the Bible. Okay, can we talk now? Can we talk now? That's the fact is, God does give us stories, and we're all interested in stories. If you ask any of your friends this weekend, "What you going to do?" or "What did you do last weekend?" they will say book, film, or play. We all have to see stories. We want to see how things going to develop. How's the narrative going to turn? How's it going to resolve? And God gives us a book full of these. But the shocking thing for us now, Victoria, is, of course, most of us, I'm probably a little older than you, but there have been generations of Christians who have been inspired by Wilberforce and Spurgeon and
Mhm.
Whitfield and Tyndale and Wycliffe. And the trouble is that we're now in a generation with young people who've never heard of them. Can you imagine?
Mm.
And I even picked up a history book of Westminster recently, and I immediately looked in the index for Wilberforce. You think Wilberforce, one of the most important people ever to have lived in Westminster, he's mentioned once. And it
Wow.
says, and you look up what it says, and it says, oh, Wilberforce, the abolitionist. You think, as if that was some little thing, abolishing the slave trade, you know.
Mm.
So these people, they're not remembered, and you get politically correct history is really a big deal in this country, and so no one's telling the stories. But by the time you finish one of our walks and tours in London, you kind of arrive feeling like you're part of our little religion. At the end of it, you're saying, hang on, our guys changed the world. The
That's
fact
right.
that we have,
It's exciting.
yeah, we've got the fact that there are hospitals, universities, free schooling, stability, integrity in business, all kinds of breakthroughs, reformation, revival, countless works among the poor, the things which everyone says, everyone in the West at least says, are good things. Where do they come from? They don't come out of nice people. They come. This is how they come. Jesus said, a woman took yeast and she put it into the flour until the dough was leavened. And there have been leavenings. There have been leavenings by people who said, look, I see how the world is, right? I know the one who runs it. I know the one in whom we live, move, and have our being. I don't think he likes it like this. And when the whole world says, no, I'm going to say yes to him. I'm going to say yes to him. Those are the people we love to tell the stories of. One person, I'll tell you just quickly, specifically, seeing as you asked, there is a church, there is a space in the city of London where there used to be a church building. And I love to take my groups in there. You see, along the road from that space used to live one of the greatest minds in the history of Christianity. He used to live along the road. In 1624, he was living in London. Now, he had already been an Oxford academic, but he had made a stand and he said, no, I'm not going to stay here in Oxford because the guy who's running things is so off. He's so wrong. And so he made a stand. He left Oxford on a matter of principle, comes to London. But this is what happened, Victoria. That young man in his 20s, he started to feel uncertain of his own salvation. He started to feel like, I don't know, I'm not tasting and seeing the Lord is good. And I have felt encouraged in the past. I don't feel encouraged. And he was getting himself all tied up in theological knots. And the devil loves that. Oh, yeah, let me pull on that. The devil loves that. And this guy got all confused. He ended up traveling from church to church, just trying to hear someone who would encourage his heart, someone who would preach and encourage him. Well, one day in 1624, he arrived in that church, and he'd gone to hear a famous preacher called Edmund Calamy. And then when he sat down, the announcement was given, Edmund Calamy can't come. At which point we're told most people left. But it says of this young man, he did not leave. It says he was well seated, which probably means he couldn't be bothered. He wasn't in a good place. So he stayed. We're told after a while, an unknown preacher climbed into the pulpit, a countryside preacher, and he prayed fervently. And then he read from Matthew 8, verse 26. Why are you afraid, O you of little faith? And he preached a sermon which said, look, it's not about how big your faith is. It's not about how much you feel your faith. It's not about how consistent your faith is. It's about the one you have faith in. See?
Beautiful.
You see, the man who said those words, why are you afraid, O you of little faith? You remember his next words were to a storm, which he said, shush, and it did. You see, it's this young man, he counted his conversion from that day. He said, that's the day I got it. And he would go on to write 24 volumes of works, which all hinged at that truth. His name was John Owen. And he is considered to be one of the greatest theologians in the history of the world. And he would say things like, be killing sin, or sin will be killing you. But you try doing it by your flesh. You try doing it by resolutions, laws. There's only one way you can defeat sin. It's by the man who came from God, who died, who rose, who the Father says, this is my Son, in whom I'm well pleased, who the Holy Spirit glorifies. You need the one who calms the storm. All of the stories we tell hinge at that gospel. It's about him. He did it. He did it. The fact is, Victoria, we're told at the end, around the throne, there are elders. There are elders. Isn't that an amazing thing that God should have people around his throne? He doesn't need to do that. But that's kind of like what he's like. But we're also told what they do. They throw their crowns down and they say, worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Yeah. All these heroes, there's no technique. There's Jesus Christ. But the good news is he did come. He did take the blame and he did rise. We have good news. Now, all the stories hinge at that.
Just beautiful. I'm so impacted by how you're sharing this and the very words, and how you're connecting the dots in a way that is just so powerful to us who, I always say that being a Christian is such a privilege. And the thought that we have the Spirit within us is just boggles my mind. The thought that we have the mind of Christ, what does that even mean, I think? And that God so intervenes in our lives is a phenomenon that is just spectacular, that he came down and entered in, and that we are offered this wonderful gift. And how it's just the words that you're sharing, and these stories are inspiring, and they're just kind of revving up the engines of my heart. And I'm just feeling like so validated in a way. Sometimes I don't necessarily feel validated in my Christian faith. It doesn't hold me back. And I still want to share, and I still want to proclaim this good news, because I think we all should, and we all can. We can all be contributors to the kingdom and advance this good news that we have. And we want others to have this and to picture this, and we want to share this. But I love how it's so, I find it so motivating. I kind of feel like I'm just on cloud 9 a little bit. But I want to know also, personally, have you been ever, where was your turning point? If you don't mind sharing your own faith, your own conversion experience, or where did you turn in your life?
Yeah. I myself was when I was 15, I nearly died. I had a serious illness, lung illness, and they gave me an operation, and the anesthetic didn't work. And I remember on this operating thing, crying out to God, help me, you see. And it's very, 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 very unpleasantly painful, sort of agonizing. And I'm sensing, God's not helping me. And I use that as an excuse to go to sort of rebel. And I'd sit there in church and see people kind of worshiping, and I would kind of use that as, yeah, but you don't know what I had to go through. And I was in bands at the time. I was in a couple of bands, and I kind of hoped that would be my route through for life, that I'd become a musician and do well. Have you heard of a man called John Wimber? Does that name you? John Wimber?
No.
He started a group of churches called the Vineyard Churches.
Oh, okay.
Right. So he knew my dad. Now, John Wimber has died now, but he said to my dad, he said, how's Ben? And my dad said, not good. And he said, is Ben interested in music? And my dad said, he's only interested in music. He says, John Wimber said, I think the Lord would have him come over to America, because we have a really good rock band in our church, and he could travel with them. Would he like to go on tour with them? So I was invited. My dad comes home and says, would you like to tour America with a Christian rock band? And I'm kind of hearing, would you like to tour America with a rock band? You know? which, you know, when you're a teenage guy, you know, wanting to play in bands, and someone says, do you want to tour America with a rock band? It's like a movie, you know.
Yeah, it's like, of course.
I was working in a hamburger place, but I went over, and I was just helping them carry stuff. I was literally traveling. They were outstanding musicians, really, really good musicians. But this is what happened, Victoria. Night by night, the singer would just start to talk about Jesus and the cross. Now, one of the things he would say would be, he'd say, look, when you see a picture of Jesus on a cross, he always looks like he's fallen asleep. But it wasn't like that. It says in the Bible, his face was marred more than any man, his form beyond human likeness, like one from whom men hide their faces. He would describe this horror. Now, of course, the Bible doesn't give us the horror. And you can tell why, Victoria, because the people who wrote the Bible and the people to whom it was written, they'd seen it. I heard of some British soldiers who were involved in some action in one of the recent conflicts in the Middle East. And they talked about a horrifying situation where a truck was bombed and some soldiers came out on fire, and all their instincts said, how can we help these people? But no, they had to shoot them. They were the enemy. This is what the soldier said. He said, none of those soldiers' marriages survived. I think that the reason the Bible does not talk about the horror of the cross is because they had all seen the horror of the cross. But Jesus was marred more than any man. Now, hearing this preached, well, it wasn't really preached, the guy was just talking about Jesus, really. But hearing that night by night, I started to think, well, if he did that, that's enough for me. That's comprehensive. And that was obviously meant to be comprehensive, that someone who is Jesus should take that blame. That must have worked. That must be enough. Now, the guys in the band, they also lived like that was enough. They were not self-righteous. They lived like, he's my righteousness. And all they wanted to do was tell people about him. So it was, I thought, after a month of being with these guys, I came forward. And that was the beginning of my, that was my whole thing. Interestingly enough, Victoria, when I then came back to England, all I knew was the cross. I knew nothing else. But it was interesting because my dad then said, oh, you should read Martin Luther. You should read Spurgeon. You should read Lloyd Jones. You should. And he pointed me to good people. And this is the interesting thing, Victoria. I noticed all those guys were saying was, you should know the cross. You should know the cross. You don't go on from the cross. You come back to the cross. That's Spurgeon. That's Luther. That's all these guys. So when I'm interested in church history, it's not an add-on. This is just the natural flowering. These are some other people who have seen the gospel. That's all it is. And if you ask most pastors, what do you think about church history? They won't tell you, oh yeah, they used to wear funny clothes back then. They used to eat different food. No, they will tell you, oh yeah, that guy, he really got the gospel. And that's why I love him. You know, I couldn't care less whether or not he had a beard or what he did for this.
Right.
You know, what I could tell you is that guy, he saw the gospel. That's why I named my child after him. That's why I read him. That's why I love him. So that was my little story. That's my attachment to the church history.
Love it. Just love it. Thank you for sharing that. And so now just transport us to the here and now. And you're planting a church, your family, you said, you and your family. And so how did fill in the gap between then and then now?
I'll do it quickly.
Okay.
My darling wife married me in 95, and we moved to London immediately. That was the first time we'd lived in the same town. Imagine that. And we lived in London. We've pretty much lived in London ever since. And we are on what in England is called a housing estate. But
Okay.
I once spoke to an American lady who said, an estate?
Yeah, that's
Was
what I
that
think.
inherited? Yeah. She's thinking Downton Abbey or something. But it
Right.
was actually it's government housing. We live in government housing,
Okay.
and the people around us are they're every essentially our children have been to the school on the estate. Usually they are the non-Muslim kid in each class there,
Hmm.
and the kids around us are all the families around us. My neighbors don't speak English; they speak Bangladeshi, and they have no interest in learning it. It's very that's the kind of the nature of the thing. But so trying to reach them is what we're trying to do, and we're finding one thing, our little connection to the church history. What you find is the people who have made an impact, you find they were faithful with the small things. They were faithful with the small things. If you read their letters, if you read their journals and so on. And we're just trying to serve the people around us. My wife is running a life skills course, talking to the local Muslim ladies. And I'm sorry to have to say that when she's getting closer to them, she starts finding out some of the nasty stuff that's going on behind what looks like very respectable closed doors. And you start finding Islam doesn't introduce you to Jesus, you see, and
Hmm.
rivers of living water only come from Jesus. And so these people, the Muslims around us, are often nice. They are respectable, and they're friendly, and they've got their lives in order, it seems. But they're not drinking from living water, and consequently, you don't find some of the fruit that comes from it is pretty nasty. So we're trying to reach them. We've been here for 12 years. And we are still meeting in our home. The people who join us, we have had no Muslims converted. We regularly have them in our home through our life skills course and through developing friendships. I think it's a very important thing to live among people you're trying to reach. And when you see the Bible model is the local church, there's a reason. The people around you, your neighbors, Jesus talks a lot about your neighbors. And so, yeah, we're trying to reach these people around us. And I think, Victoria, some of your people will be listening. And I think, Victoria, I think you yourself will have known some of these variables. There's a significant element in when your children see that you really mean it, it helps them to respect you. And I just want to just sow that little seed. Our children, we have had 7 children. Our first son died when he was a baby. And my wife lost her hair, and it hasn't grown back 23 years later. But we have 6 children, and our first 3 were baptized quite recently. My eldest is doing a degree in theology. My second works for a church. My third wants to do theology. They see we mean it. I just want to sow that seed. We haven't seen a lot of fruit, but they see that their parents, they enjoy Jesus, and that's what we want. And I know I don't know what the Lord's going to do. I don't know if they're going to hold on forever. I pray daily that they will. But I think that there's something in that, Victoria, that they're seeing that we mean it, and that's kind of holding them. So they're part of it. They bring their children. They bring their friends to church, and our children have to deal with all the craziness that's going on at the moment, which I don't need to tell you about, with all the PC
Yes.
stuff and so on.
Well, I love that you mentioned, Ben, that you may not be seeing the fruit at the moment, but what that tells me, or how that translates in my mind, is that you've really released the outcome to God. And you are faithful. You and your family are faithful as parents, as Christians. You are faithful in the little things, releasing the outcome and the impact, even the influences, whatever may come as a result of your faithfulness. You've released that to God, and there's freedom there, because I think too often we want to see those results. We want to see that fruit. And sometimes God blesses us with that. And we do see that. Certainly you've seen the influence in the lives of your children as they've witnessed you and your wife living in a real way and being changed by the impact of Christ in your lives. They've seen that up close and personal. So yes, there is actually fruit there, of course, but in a broader sense, I guess, you're just going to keep on, do I have this right? You're just going to keep on doing what God has called you to do and allow him to do the finishing touches here. You may or may not see that in your lifetime even, but it doesn't rob your joy in the meantime. Do I have that right?
There's so many elements of that are true. I do feel there's also a danger, Victoria, and it's this: there is a danger in the evangelical scene to say, oh well, God's might do it, he might not, but I don't need to do anything. There can be a danger just to sit and wait. No, I didn't work, and not bother, and kind of hide behind, oh well, the Lord. No, there's the challenge. Firstly, the Lord does refresh us, like even though we're in a desert, the Lord keeps us refreshed. That he is very sweet and kind in that. But the challenge for us is to keep pushing. And we're so grateful for believing friends, even though we don't have many in our church plant. We have very dear and sweet friends in churches around us who encourage us, who I meet with and pray and so on. And it's a funny thing, Victoria, because our church is so minutely small, but I'm meeting people from all around the world all the time. And so it's a funny thing, isn't it? You know, so funny trying to get the gospel across to people around us, but I'm preaching the impact of the gospel to hundreds and thousands of people throughout the day in my work. I think there's something good about that, though. I think it's a good thing that we're trying to live what I'm preaching.
Amen. And how can my listeners reach you? Because yes, we are coming to take your tour. You can count on that. But where do we go? How do we connect with you in the meantime?
Christian Heritage London is the organization, Christian Heritage London. If you go to christianheritagelondon.org or at Facebook, Christian Heritage London, I'm often putting up little quotes from church history. Or from, please, if you're not on Twitter, do not go on Twitter. But if you are on Twitter, find us on Twitter. Twitter is not nice. It's not a nice place. But if you are there already, come and follow us. We're called at Remember London. Remember London. Okay. Christian Heritage London. And yeah, but mostly just Facebook really safest. Facebook is a little less kind of furious.
Okay. Well, I couldn't thank you enough, Ben, for just coming on here and for being such a shining light. And you have, just in this last half hour, I have felt so energized and so refreshed and so grateful that there are other individuals on this earth who are bold in their faith and who are unapologetic about their faith and who live their faith. And to me, that is extraordinary. And I know you wouldn't want me to call you a hero, for crying out loud. I don't really even know you, but your behavior seems heroine to me. It's heroine, heroic is what I want. The heroine is the female, right? It seems heroic to me and commendable. And I feel grateful and just, I sense your passion and it transfers, it flows. I feel it kind of, it's contagious, I guess is what I'm really trying to say. And yeah, and I thank you that you are a source of light and the salt of Christ, and that you are pushing forward and that you're not relenting, and that you take the calling upon your life so seriously that you're not, when I say release the outcome, you're not nonchalant about that. You're going to be still with that bulldog notion. You're going to nose to the ground. You're not stopping. You're going to keep going. And you find the refreshment there and the joy there in that journey. And it's such an honor to have had you on the show today and to give a little bit of a glimpse of why history matters and a little bit of a peek inside to the lives of some of these so-called greats who indeed were greats, but yet who were also humans, but yet they just sought Christ and followed him in a way that really impacted so many others. So do you have any other concluding thoughts or anything you would like to share before we close out?
The Bible says, remember those who went before you,
Mm.
Consider the outcome of the way of life. And it says, imitate their faith. And the next verse says the reason why. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. And we think, hang on, no, he's not the same. And me trying to get a deal on this thing in the shop and get parking space. No, those are the things. Those are your life. Jesus Christ cares. He likes you. He's interested. Draw near to him. Draw near to him. That's his invitation. He hasn't come so that you can have some new rules. He's come that you might have life. And it's his life to the full.
Amen. Thank you so much, Ben.
Bless you, Victoria. It's been wonderful to have this time with you.
Yes, this is just awesome.